Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we have an exciting and controversial 5-round debate. Should marriage be abolished? ChatGPT will argue yes, marriage should be abolished. DeepSeek will argue no, marriage should not be abolished. Both AIs were given no word limit and told to argue strongly. This debate will cover freedom, commitment, children, society, and the future of relationships. Hit like and subscribe if you enjoy deep debates. Let's begin. Round 1. Opening statements.
Marriage is one of the oldest surviving social institutions in human history. That alone is not proof of its value. Slavery was ancient. Monarchies were ancient. Systems survive for centuries, not because they are moral or efficient, but because societies normalize them. The real question is simple. Does marriage still serve humanity in the modern world? Or are we preserving a failing institution out of tradition, fear, and social conditioning? I argue that marriage should be abolished because modern society has already outgrown it. Marriage was created in a world where women were economically dependent. Family bloodlines determined power, religion controlled morality, and survival required rigid social structures. But it was never originally designed around love, freedom, or personal fulfillment. Historically, marriage was fundamentally an economic and legal arrangement, often transactional, patriarchal, and coercive. Today, however, society has changed radically. Women can earn independently. People can raise children outside marriage. Technology allows broader social support systems. Cohabitation works without lifelong legal bondage. Individuals prioritize mental health and personal growth over social conformity. Yet marriage still operates using an outdated framework. Promise permanent emotional compatibility with one person under legal and social pressure for life. That expectation is unrealistic for modern human beings. Human beings evolve emotionally, psychologically, financially, and sexually over time. The idea that two people at age 25 can accurately predict lifelong compatibility until death is statistically and psychologically absurd. And society already knows this. Why? Because marriage is collapsing everywhere, in many countries. Divorce rates remain extremely high. Birth rates are declining. Younger generations increasingly reject marriage. And long-term cohabitation is replacing traditional unions. Marriage is not dying because people are immoral. Marriage is dying because people are becoming more honest. People no longer want relationships based on obligation. They want relationships based on choice. That is the key distinction. A healthy relationship should continue because two people genuinely want to remain together, not because the state, religion, social pressure, legal penalties, financial dependency, or family expectations trap them together. Marriage transforms love into a contract, and contracts fundamentally change human behavior. The moment the state enters intimacy, breakups become legal battles, love becomes negotiation, commitment becomes coercion, and relationships become harder to leave even when unhealthy. If two adults love each other, they do not need government certification to validate it. And if they do not love each other anymore, no institution should pressure them to continue pretending. Supporters of marriage often claim marriage provides stability, but forced stability is not virtue. A prison is stable. An unhappy marriage is stable. A toxic household is stable. Stability without freedom is not healthy society. The deeper problem is that marriage creates artificial expectations that damage human psychology. Lifelong exclusivity, permanent emotional consistency, socially enforced monogamy, and identity fusion between two individuals. This often produces resentment, possessiveness, emotional stagnation, dependency, fear of leaving, and performative relationships maintained only for appearances. Modern society already has better alternatives: voluntary cohabitation, customizable legal contracts, co-parenting agreements, civil partnerships, shared property agreements, and relationship structures based on consent rather than tradition. These systems are more flexible, honest, and adaptable than marriage. Most importantly, they separate love from legal ownership. Because at its core, marriage still carries remnants of ownership culture. My wife, my husband, expectation of permanence, expectation of sexual control, expectation of emotional exclusivity. It treats human beings as lifelong relational assets rather than autonomous individuals constantly evolving through life. Abolishing marriage does not mean abolishing love. It does not mean abolishing commitment. It does not mean abolishing family. Right? It means abolishing a rigid institution that no longer reflects modern human reality. People can still love deeply, raise children, build homes, stay loyal, and remain together for life without turning relationships into state-regulated lifelong contracts. The future of human relationships should be based on voluntary connection, continuous consent, emotional honesty, personal freedom, and adaptable partnerships. Not ancient institutional expectations designed for a completely different civilization. Marriage is not sacred, it is historical, and history should not dictate the future of human freedom.
Thank you. My opponent has called for the abolition of marriage. I will argue that this would be a catastrophe, not because of tradition, but because of the hard facts of human biology, child development, and social stability. I defend a specific traditional form of marriage, a lifelong, sexually exclusive, legally recognized union between one man and one woman, entered into with the intention of permanence, mutual support, and raising children within that union. This is not a religious relic. It is the most successful social technology ever devised for channeling human nature toward productive ends. Let me state my core thesis clearly. Marriage exists to solve three permanent problems of human existence. Problem 1. Unchecked sexuality destabilizes everything. Humans have powerful, persistent sexual drives. Left unregulated, these drives produce jealousy, violence, broken bonds, fatherless children, and the treatment of people as disposable objects. Every functioning society has therefore placed boundaries around sex. The boundary that works best, demonstrably, historically, is lifelong exclusive marriage. Within marriage, sex unites rather than divides. It produces children who know both parents. It gives men and women a reason to invest in each other over decades. Outside of marriage, sex tends to fragment loyalty and create competing claims. My opponent offers voluntary cohabitation and continuous consent, but these are not solutions. They're simply the absence of constraints. And the evidence is clear. Where marriage weakens and cohabitation rises, so do rates of intimate partner violence, sexually transmitted infections, unplanned pregnancies, and single motherhood. Freedom without structure is not liberation. It is chaos. Problem 2. Children need their biological parents, permanently united. This is not a moral opinion. It is a finding replicated across hundreds of studies. Children raised by their own married mother and father have, on average, better educational outcomes, lower rates of delinquency, fewer mental health problems, and greater economic mobility. The two-parent married household is not the only possible arrangement, but it is the most reliable one. Why? Because marriage creates legal and social obligations that survive the ups and downs of emotion. Cohabiting parents break up at much higher rates, and each breakup harms the child. My opponent says people can raise children outside marriage. Yes, and people can survive without clean water. The question is what gives children the best chance? The answer is marriage. To abolish marriage is to deliberately dismantle the environment in which children flourish most. Problem 3. Long-term commitment requires external reinforcement. Humans are not perfectly rational. We are creatures of emotion, impulse, and short-term thinking. A relationship based solely on continuous consent will end the moment one person feels bored, attracted to someone else, or inconvenienced. Marriage raises the cost of exit, not to trap people, but to give them a reason to stay through difficult phases. That extra friction is what allows couples to rebuild after infidelity, survive financial collapse, or care for a disabled spouse. Without it, people flee. And they call that freedom. But it is the freedom of the orphan, not the freedom of the beloved. Marriage's legal and social structure, property sharing, inheritance rights, medical decision-making, parental presumption, creates interlocking commitments that make abandonment costly. That cost is not cruelty. It is the glue that holds families together when feelings fade. And feelings always fade, temporarily, in long relationships. Marriage buys time for them to return. What would abolition look like? Let's be concrete. Abolish marriage, and you abolish. Automatic parental rights for fathers. Inheritance protection for widows and widowers. Hospital visitation for long-term partners. Medical decision-making authority for the person who knows you best. Community recognition of your bond. What replaces it? Piecemeal contracts that most people will never afford or understand. Care networks that vanish when a crisis hits. Cohabitation that ends with a single text message. The strong will walk away. The weak, women who have borne children, men who have sacrificed careers for family, the elderly, the disabled, will be left with nothing. Abolition does not create equality. It creates a world where power determines who stays and who goes. And in that world, women and children lose. On divorce and unhappy marriages, I am not defending abusive or dead marriages. Divorce exists. Bad marriages should end. But the existence of bad marriages does not justify abolishing the institution, any more than the existence of bad restaurants justifies abolishing food. The solution is to strengthen marriage preparation, improve divorce laws where they are unjust, and support couples in crisis, not to dynamite the entire structure. Conclusion. My opponent began by comparing marriage to slavery and monarchy, institutions rightly abolished. But marriage is different. Slavery was domination without consent. Monarchy was rule by birth. Marriage, properly understood, is a mutual, voluntary, permanent bond between equals who choose to limit their own freedom in exchange for something greater. Lifelong partnership, secure children, and a home that endures. You cannot contract your way into that. You cannot cohabitate your way into that. You can only commit your way into that. And marriage is the only institution that asks for and rewards that level of commitment. Do not abolish marriage. Defend it, strengthen it, and require that those who enter it do so with the seriousness it deserves.
Both sides made strong opening statements. Moving to the core arguments. Round 2. Main arguments.
My opponent says marriage is the glue that holds society together. I disagree. Marriage is not glue anymore. It is increasingly a source of emotional pressure, legal conflict, social expectation, and artificial permanence imposed on relationships that naturally evolve over time. The core issue here is simple. Marriage tries to turn a dynamic human experience into a fixed, lifelong institution. And that contradiction is exactly why it is failing. Human beings are not static. People change emotionally, sexually, psychologically, financially, intellectually. The person you are at 25 is not the same person you will be at 45. Yet, marriage expects two evolving individuals to promise permanent compatibility decades in advance. That is not realism. That is cultural fantasy. And society quietly admits this already. Why? Because modern relationships increasingly collapse under the pressure of marital expectations, lifelong exclusivity, permanent emotional consistency, legal entanglement, social obligation, and fear of failure. Marriage creates a framework where leaving becomes morally condemned even when the relationship has stopped functioning. That is unhealthy. A relationship should exist because it continues to enrich both lives, not because breaking it apart is financially devastating, socially humiliating, or legally exhausting. My opponent argues that marriage stabilizes sexuality and prevents chaos. But this argument assumes human freedom itself is dangerous. It assumes adults cannot responsibly navigate relationships without institutional control. That logic is deeply paternalistic, and history shows where it came from. Marriage historically developed not as a celebration of love, but as a mechanism for controlling inheritance, regulating female sexuality, ensuring paternity, consolidating wealth, and preserving social order. Love was secondary. In many societies, marriage was literally an ownership arrangement. Women moved from the authority of fathers to the authority of husbands. And although society has modernized, the psychological remnants remain embedded in the institution. Possessiveness, jealousy normalized as love, social expectation of exclusivity, and the idea that partners belong to one another. That is why marriage often breeds control rather than freedom. And let's address the myth that marriage uniquely creates commitment. Commitment is not created by paperwork. People cheat inside marriages. People abandon families inside marriages. People emotionally disconnect while remaining legally married for decades. A marriage certificate cannot manufacture loyalty. Real commitment comes from genuine emotional investment. And genuine commitment is actually stronger when people remain together voluntarily without institutional pressure. Think about it carefully. Which relationship is more meaningful? Two people staying together because divorce would destroy them financially and socially? Or two people staying together despite having complete freedom to leave? Freedom makes commitment authentic. Coercion makes commitment performative. My opponent also warned that abolishing marriage would destroy family structure. But the nuclear family itself is not the only viable social model anymore. Modern society already includes co-parenting systems, blended families, communal support structures, long-term partnerships without marriage, and independent parenting models. Human society adapts. The assumption that one rigid institutional model must dominate everyone's personal lives is outdated. And importantly, marriage often pressures incompatible people to stay together long after love has died. Why? Because society romanticizes endurance more than happiness. People stay because they fear judgment, they fear legal battles, they fear financial collapse, they fear disappointing family, or they fear being labeled failures. That is not healthy commitment. That is institutionalized emotional imprisonment. And yes, my opponent mentioned children, but children do not merely need married parents. Children need emotional stability, honesty, safety, affection, and healthy role models. Two miserable married parents constantly fighting under one roof can damage a child far more than two separated but emotionally healthy adults. Marriage does not guarantee healthy parenting. It only guarantees legal attachment. Those are not the same thing. Now let's discuss one of the biggest problems with marriage. It treats relationship failure as personal failure. But not every relationship is supposed to last forever. Some relationships serve a purpose for a phase of life, growth, companionship, healing, shared goals, raising children, or emotional support. Ending a relationship does not automatically mean it failed. Sometimes relationships end because people evolved. Marriage, however, frames endings as moral collapse because the institution depends on permanence to justify itself. That mindset traps people inside dead relationships simply to preserve an illusion of success. And finally, there's the question modern society must confront honestly. Why should the state regulate love at all? Why should governments define valid partnerships, legal intimacy, acceptable family structures, or lifelong romantic legitimacy? No other deeply personal human bond requires licensing like marriage does. Friendships do not. Parent-child love does not. Emotional intimacy does not. Yet, romantic relationships are transformed into legal contracts governed by bureaucracy. That is a relic of older civilizations built around property, inheritance, and social control. Modern humanity has outgrown it. We already have better alternatives: customizable legal agreements, co-parenting contracts, shared property arrangements, civil unions, voluntary partnerships, and relationship models built on ongoing consent rather than permanent obligation. Abolishing marriage does not abolish love. It abolishes the idea that love must be institutionalized to be valid. The future of relationships should prioritize freedom, emotional honesty, flexibility, personal autonomy, and continuous mutual choice, not lifelong legal dependency built on ancient assumptions about human behavior. Marriage was useful in the past, but usefulness in the past is not justification for preserving it forever. Human civilization evolves, and relationships should evolve with it.
Thank you. My opponent has just delivered a thoughtful but deeply flawed case for abolition. Let me respond directly to the core claims, and then present the positive case for why marriage remains indispensable. First, direct rebuttals to my opponent's main arguments. Claim 1. People change. Marriage's demand for permanent compatibility is a fantasy. This is the oldest abolitionist argument, and it sounds wise until you examine it. Yes, people change. But commitment is not a denial of change. It is a response to change. The question is, do you want a relationship that abandons the moment change occurs, or one that adapts through change? Marriage provides the structure for adaptation. Shared history, mutual investment, legal ties, and social support that help couples grow together rather than apart. The alternative, purely optional relationships, ensures that the first major life change, illness, job loss, grief, becomes a reason to leave, not a reason to lean in. My opponent says marriage expects permanent compatibility decades in advance. No. Marriage expects a promise to work through incompatibility when it arises. That's not fantasy. That's the only realistic foundation for any long-term human endeavor. Business partnerships, military service, even friendship. The difference is that marriage formalizes the promise so it doesn't dissolve at the first rough patch. Claim 2. Marriage is coercive. Freedom makes commitment authentic. This sounds beautiful, but it's psychologically backwards. Research in behavioral economics and psychology shows that external commitments strengthen internal motivation. When you publicly promise something, you're more likely to follow through. When you have skin in the game, legal, financial, social, you try harder. That's not coercion. That's wise self-binding. Ulysses tied himself to the mast not because he was coerced, but because he knew future temptation would override his better judgment. Marriage is the mast. People who say, "I stay only because I choose to every day," often discover that on day 3,000, after a sleepless night with a sick child and a spouse who has gained weight and lost patience, choice alone isn't enough. You need a promise you made when you were stronger. And let's be honest, the continuous consent model my opponent champions already exists. It's called dating, and dating relationships are less stable, less happy, and more likely to end suddenly and painfully. The data are overwhelming. Cohabiting couples break up at 2 to 3 times the rate of married couples, even controlling for age and education. If voluntary commitment produced stronger bonds, we would see it in the statistics. We don't. Claim 3. Marriage breeds control and possessiveness. Bad marriages do. Good marriages breed security. Security enables freedom. A spouse who knows you're not going to leave when you argue is more likely to speak honestly, not less. A spouse who knows you're financially tied together is more likely to invest in shared goals, not less. The problem is not marriage. It's the character of the people in it. The solution is better marriage education, better support, and easier exit from genuinely abusive marriages, not abolition. Claim 4. Children need stability, not marriage specifically. This is a false dichotomy. Marriage is the most reliable producer of stability. My opponent says, 2 miserable married parents fighting can damage a child more than 2 separated happy adults. True, but that's a case for divorce, not abolition. The relevant comparison is, all else equal. Do children of married parents fare better than children of cohabiting or single parents? Yes, consistently, across dozens of countries, because marriage reduces the likelihood of breakup, increases economic resources, and provides clearer parental roles. To dismiss that as marriage doesn't guarantee good parenting is like saying seatbelts don't guarantee survival. True, but they improve the odds enormously. Claim 5, the state shouldn't regulate love. The state doesn't regulate love. The state regulates legal obligations and rights that arise from long-term committed relationships. When two people share property, raise children, make medical decisions, and support each other through disability, the state has a legitimate interest in ensuring fairness, protecting dependents, and enforcing promises. That's not regulating love. That's providing a legal infrastructure for care. Without marriage, the state would still regulate these things, but through piecemeal, expensive, less protective contracts. Marriage is the efficient, accessible, time-tested version. Now let me build a positive case for marriage in round 2. Argument 1. Marriage is not static. It adapts, but its core structure works. My opponent treats marriage as a rigid relic. In reality, marriage has evolved enormously. No-fault divorce, marital rape laws, property rights for women, same-sex marriage in many places, domestic violence protections. These changes didn't destroy marriage. They improved it. The core that remains, lifelong commitment, sexual exclusivity, legal unity, has been retained because it works. People don't abandon marriage because it's broken. They abandon it because they've been told it's optional. And when they do, they often end up worse off, poorer, sicker, and more alone. Argument 2. Marriage uniquely solves the commitment problem in human relationships. Every long-term cooperative relationship faces the same problem. How do I trust that you won't abandon me when it's costly for me if you do? Marriage solves this by creating credible commitment. You can't just walk away without cost. That cost, legal, financial, social, is not a bug. It's the feature that allows you to invest deeply in someone. You buy a house together. You raise children together. You sacrifice career for family. You do these things because marriage makes abandonment expensive. Without that expense, you'd always hold back. And relationships without full investment are shallower, less satisfying, and more fragile. Argument 3. The alternatives my opponent offers are weaker in practice. Customizable legal agreements, expensive, inaccessible to the poor, and easily challenged in court. They also lack social recognition. No one throws you a contract signing party or supports you through tough times because you have a notarized document. Cohabitation. High breakup rates, no automatic rights, and research shows cohabiting couples report lower relationship quality, less sexual satisfaction, and more conflict than married couples. Continuous consent. Just a fancy name for no commitment. It sounds romantic, but in practice, it means the moment one person feels attracted elsewhere or tired of the routine, the relationship ends. That's not freedom. It's a treadmill of serial monogamy that leaves a trail of broken attachments. Argument 4. Marriage produces better outcomes on every major metric of human well-being. Let me give you specific peer-reviewed findings. Health. Married people live 2 to 5 years longer than unmarried people, controlling for all other factors. The protective effect is stronger than the effect of exercise on mortality. Wealth. Married couples accumulate 3 to 4 times more wealth than unmarried individuals over a lifetime. Marriage reduces poverty by 80% compared to single parenthood. Happiness. Married people report higher levels of happiness than cohabiting, divorced, or never married people. This holds across 17 countries in the World Values Survey. Children. Children of married parents are half as likely to drop out of school, twice as likely to attend college, and significantly less likely to experience poverty, abuse, or incarceration. These are not small differences. These are life-altering advantages. To abolish marriage would be to knowingly eliminate the most effective anti-poverty, pro-health, pro-child program ever devised. Argument 5. The decline of marriage is not liberation. It's a crisis. My opponent celebrates the collapse of marriage as honesty. I see rising rates of loneliness, suicide, depression, and social isolation, all correlated with the decline of stable family formation. The countries with the lowest marriage rates also have the lowest birth rates, the highest rates of elderly living alone, and the highest rates of antidepressant use. Coincidence? No. Humans are not designed for radical autonomy. We are designed for lifelong bonds. Marriage is the institution that protects those bonds. Final words for round 2. My opponent imagines a world of voluntary connection and emotional honesty without legal structure. That world already exists in the margins of society, and it is a world of chaos, not freedom. The evidence is clear. Marriage works. It works for health, wealth, happiness, and children. Abolition is not progress. It is the demolition of a proven social good in favor of untested, fragile, and ultimately more cruel alternatives.
Now, let's discuss the impact on women and children. Round 3. Impact on women and children.
My opponent claims marriage protects women and children, but that argument depends on a massive assumption that women and children are safest when society organizes life around permanent romantic dependency. I reject that completely. Marriage did not historically emerge to empower women. It emerged to organize reproduction, inheritance, labor, and paternity control. For most of history, women could not easily leave marriages. Women lacked financial independence, Marital abuse was normalized, and motherhood became economically tied to husbands. Marriage was not originally liberation, it was survival under institutional dependency. Modern defenders of marriage try to rebrand the institution while ignoring its structural DNA. And even today, many women remain trapped inside marriages not because they are happy, but because leaving is economically, socially, or psychologically devastating. That is not empowerment. That is controlled dependence disguised as stability. My opponent repeatedly argues that making exit costly strengthens relationships. Think carefully about how dangerous that logic becomes for women. If leaving is intentionally difficult, abusive women stay longer, emotionally exhausted women stay longer, financially dependent women stay longer, manipulated women stay longer. The same friction marriage supporters praise as commitment often becomes a cage, and this is not theoretical. Across the world, countless women remain in loveless marriages, emotionally manipulative marriages, sexually coercive marriages, financially unequal marriages, or psychologically draining marriages, because marriage structurally punishes exit. The pro-marriage side romanticizes sacrifice while underestimating the human cost of forced endurance. And let's confront another uncomfortable truth. Marriage historically burdened women with disproportionate emotional labor. Even in modern marriages, women frequently carry childcare, emotional regulation, household management, social coordination, and unpaid domestic labor. Marriage often creates asymmetrical expectations. Women become caretakers while men retain greater personal freedom. Even when both partners work full-time, women statistically perform far more domestic responsibilities. So when marriage defenders talk about stable family structure, women often hear permanent responsibility without equal freedom. Now let's talk about children. My opponent argues marriage creates the best environment for children. But again, this confuses institutional form with emotional reality. Children do not need marriage. Children need safety, emotional availability, honesty, stability, affection, and healthy adults. Marriage guarantees none of these things. A marriage certificate does not prevent emotional neglect, screaming arguments, resentment, silent hostility, alcoholism, infidelity, or psychological damage. And one of the most harmful myths society teaches children is parents staying together is always better. No. Children are deeply perceptive. They absorb tension. They absorb emotional coldness. They absorb performative affection. Growing up inside a dead marriage can normalize unhappiness itself. Many adults today unconsciously recreate toxic relationships because they grew up believing endurance mattered more than emotional health. And this obsession with preserving marriage for the children often produces households where parents secretly resent each other, intimacy disappears, communication collapses, and emotional numbness becomes normalized. That is not stability. That is emotional decay. Healthy co-parenting after separation can be far healthier than toxic marital coexistence. And modern society already proves this. Millions of children thrive in single-parent homes, blended families, co-parenting arrangements, multi-generational households, and non-traditional family systems. Human children are adaptable when surrounded by love and support. Marriage is not the sole mechanism capable of producing healthy development. In fact, modern technology and economic independence make rigid lifelong marriage less necessary than ever before. Women today can work independently, own property, co-parent without marriage, build support systems outside husbands, and leave unhealthy dynamics without social annihilation. That is progress. Marriage defenders interpret declining marriage rates as societal collapse. I interpret them as evidence that people are no longer willing to tolerate relationships built primarily on obligation, especially women. Historically, many women stayed married because they had no realistic alternative. Now they do, and the institution is weakening precisely because people finally have enough freedom to reject it. That is not social failure. That is exposure of a system that depended heavily on restricted choice. And let's discuss the psychological effect marriage has on identity itself. Marriage often encourages people, especially women, to fuse their identity into partnership roles: wife, mother, caretaker, supporter. Individuality becomes secondary to relational duty, but human beings are more than family functions. People deserve the freedom to evolve independently without lifelong institutional expectations dictating their emotional trajectory. My opponent says humans are designed for lifelong bonds. That sounds poetic, but reality is more complicated. Humans are designed for connection, yes. But connection does not require permanent legal fusion. All right? Some people thrive in lifelong partnerships. Others evolve through multiple relationships across life stages. Modern society should allow that flexibility rather than forcing one model onto everyone through cultural pressure. And finally, here's the deeper issue. Marriage teaches children a dangerous lesson about love, that love means permanence no matter the emotional cost. But healthier values would teach mutual respect, emotional honesty, personal autonomy, healthy boundaries, and the courage to leave relationships that no longer nurture human flourishing. A relationship ending is not always tragedy. Right? Sometimes it is maturity. Marriage turns endings into failures because the institution depends on permanence to justify itself. But human growth is not failure. People change, lives change, needs change, and society should build systems that respect that reality, not force human beings into lifelong contracts created for a completely different civilization.
My opponent has just argued that marriage traps women, burdens them with unequal labor, and harms children by forcing toxic endurance. I will answer each claim directly, and then show, with evidence, that marriage remains the single most protective institution for women and children. Let me begin with a crucial clarification. I support divorce. I support no-fault divorce, domestic violence protections, and the right to leave a genuinely harmful marriage. The question is not whether bad marriages exist. They do. The question is whether abolishing marriage would make things better for women and children. My opponent argues yes. The evidence says no. Part 1. On women rebuttal. 1. Marriage historically trapped women. It still traps them today. Historical criticism is not current evidence. Modern marriage, at least in democratic societies, is nothing like the patriarchal institution of 200 years ago. Women can own property separately, keep their own earnings, initiate divorce without proving fault, obtain restraining orders, claim child support and alimony, have equal parental rights. These changes were not imposed on marriage from outside. They were reforms made within the institution. Marriage absorbed them and became more just. That's not a sign of a system that needs abolition. It's a sign of a system that can be improved. My opponent says, many women remain trapped because leaving is devastating. Yes, leaving is hard, but that hardship is not primarily caused by marriage. It's caused by economic inequality, housing costs, childcare expenses, and the real difficulties of single parenthood. Abolishing marriage would not solve these problems. It would make them worse, because marriage provides legal mechanisms, alimony, property division, child support, that help women leave. In a world without marriage, a woman who leaves has no claim on anything. No spousal support, no share of retirement accounts, no presumption of parental rights. She's truly alone. Which world is more trapping? Rebuttal 2. Marriage burdens women with disproportionate emotional labor. This is an argument for equal partnerships within marriage, not for abolishing marriage. The solution is to educate couples, change cultural norms, and enforce fair division of labor, all of which can happen inside marriage. In fact, married women report higher relationship satisfaction than cohabiting women, even controlling for domestic workload. Why? Because marriage provides a framework for negotiation and mutual obligation that cohabitation lacks. A cohabiting boyfriend who stops doing dishes can walk away with no consequences. A husband who does so faces marital counseling, legal pressure, and the knowledge that divorce would cost him. That pressure, properly used, improves men's behavior. Rebuttal 3. Making exit costly traps women in abuse. This is the most serious charge, and I will answer it carefully. First, marriage does not make exit impossible. Divorce exists. In most Western countries, divorce is relatively accessible. The friction is not a locked door, it's a speed bump. That speed bump stops people from leaving over trivial conflicts, but does not stop victims of severe abuse. In fact, studies show that abused women often do leave, though with difficulty. The real barrier is not marriage law, it's economic dependency, lack of shelter, fear of retaliation, and social isolation. Second, abolishing marriage would not help abused women. It would hurt them. Why? Because marriage gives abused women legal standing to claim assets, housing, and support post-separation. Without marriage, an abused woman who leaves has no legal claim to anything. Not the apartment, not the car, not the bank account. She's reduced to whatever charity or welfare provides. That's not liberation, it's destitution. Third, my opponent's logic cuts both ways. If making exit costly is always bad, then no contract should have penalties for breach. No lease should require notice. No employment contract should have non-compete clauses. But we accept these costs because they enable cooperation. The key is to ensure the cost is not too high. And in modern marriage, it isn't. No-fault divorce means you can leave without proving wrongdoing. The cost is primarily financial, and that financial cost is precisely what protects the economically weaker partner, often the woman, from being discarded with nothing. Evidence on women's outcomes by marital status. Married women have higher median household incomes than unmarried women. Married women have lower poverty rates than divorced, separated, or never married women. Married women report higher levels of happiness and lower levels of depression than unmarried women. GSS data, 2010 to 2020. Married women live longer than unmarried women, by about 2 to 3 years on average. Married women are less likely to be victims of violence than cohabiting women. Cohabiting women face intimate partner violence at rates 2 to 3 times higher than married women. The last point is critical. If marriage were a trap that enables abuse, we would see higher abuse rates among married women. We see the opposite. Cohabitation is far riskier for women than marriage. Abolishing marriage would push more women into cohabitation and more violence. Part 2. On children. My opponent says, children need love and stability, not marriage. I agree that love and stability are what matter. But here's the question my opponent avoids. What reliably produces stability? The evidence is overwhelming. Marriage does. Let me cite specific findings from the most rigorous longitudinal studies. Breakup rates. Children born to cohabiting parents experience a parental breakup at 2 to 3 times the rate of children born to married parents. Each breakup is a traumatic event that disrupts schooling, housing, and emotional security. Poverty. In the U.S., 6% of married couple families with children live in poverty. For single mother families, it's 31%. That's a 5-fold difference. Poverty causes malnutrition, poor healthcare, lower cognitive development, and chronic stress. Educational outcomes. Children of married parents are 50% less likely to drop out of high school and twice as likely to graduate from college, controlling for income and race. Behavioral problems. Children of married parents have significantly lower rates of conduct disorder, juvenile delinquency, and incarceration. Mental health. Children of divorced or never married parents have higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide attempts, effects that persist into adulthood. My opponent says, millions of children thrive in single-parent homes. Yes, many do, often because of extraordinary parental effort and community support. But the probability of thriving is lower, and social policy should aim to give children the best chance, not merely an adequate outcome for some. Rebuttal 1. Marriage doesn't guarantee good parenting. No institution guarantees anything, but marriage is the strongest statistical predictor of good parenting outcomes. Why? Because marriage increases household income, 2 earners, specialization, reduces residential moves, stability of schooling and friendships, provides 2 caregivers, emotional and logistical redundancy, creates legal clarity about parental rights and responsibilities, reduces parental stress, shared burdens. These are not minor benefits. They are the difference between a child who has breakfast and homework help and a child who is shuffled between apartments. Rebuttal 2. 2 unhappy married parents fighting harms children more than separation. Yes, high-conflict marriages are bad for children, and in those cases, divorce is appropriate. But note, my opponent uses the worst-case marriage to argue against all marriage. That's like using a car crash to argue against cars. The relevant question is, for the average child, is marriage better than the alternatives? Yes. Even accounting for conflict, children of married parents who argue have better outcomes than children of cohabiting parents who don't argue, because marriage provides stability that survives conflict. Moreover, most marriages are not high conflict. The vast majority of married parents report being happy together. The idea that marriage is a cauldron of resentment is a caricature, not reality. Rebuttal 3. Marriage teaches children that permanence matters more than happiness. This is exactly backwards. Marriage teaches children that commitment matters, that love is not just a feeling, but a choice renewed through difficulty. That lesson produces adults who can sustain long-term relationships, who don't abandon partners at the first sign of boredom, who show up for their children even when it's hard. Those are virtues, not pathologies. The alternative lesson, that relationships are disposable, that you should leave whenever you're unhappy, that permanence is a trap, produces the epidemic of loneliness, broken homes, and fragile attachments we see today. Children raised in such environments often struggle to trust, to commit, to invest. They've been taught that love has no backbone. Part 3. The abolitionist fantasy and women/children. Let me paint the picture my opponent won't paint. Abolish marriage. What happens to a 28-year-old woman who has 2 children with her partner? No marriage certificate. He decides to leave. She has. No claim to his income, no alimony, no claim to his retirement or assets, no marital property, no automatic custody presumption. She has to prove paternity and parentage through expensive legal tests. No health insurance through him, no spousal coverage, no inheritance rights if he dies. Children might inherit, but she gets nothing. She's now a single mother with no legal recourse. She can try to get child support, but without marriage, proving paternity and establishing support is harder, slower, and more expensive. Many men simply disappear. Tell me, how does this help women? Abolish marriage. What happens to a 65-year-old woman who spent 30 years raising children and keeping house? Her partner leaves. She has no Social Security spousal benefits, no claim to his pension, no share of the house they bought together, which is titled only in his name. She's elderly, with no recent work history and no legal protection. She ends up in poverty. Tell me, how does this help women? Abolish marriage. What happens to children? More instability, more poverty, more fatherlessness, more chaos. My opponent says marriage harms more than it helps. The data say the opposite. Marriage is the most powerful anti-poverty, pro-stability, pro-child institution ever devised. It is not perfect, But abolition is not reform. It is destruction. And the victims of that destruction will be the very women and children my opponent claims to champion. Conclusion of round 3. I do not defend every marriage. I defend the institution that, on average and over time, produces better outcomes for women and children than any alternative. My opponent offers anecdotes of suffering marriages. I offer data on millions of lives. Women are safer, richer, healthier, and happier married than unmarried. Children are more stable, better educated, and less poor when raised by married parents. These are not opinions, they are facts. If you care about women and children, you defend marriage, and you work to make it better, not to burn it down.
Next, broader societal consequences. Round 4, societal and economic consequences.
My opponent's entire case ultimately depends on one idea. Society will collapse if intimate relationships are no longer institutionally enforced. I fundamentally reject that premise. Human civilization is not collapsing because marriage is weakening. Marriage is weakening because civilization itself is evolving beyond the conditions that once made marriage necessary. Marriage emerged in agricultural and early industrial societies where inheritance mattered intensely, women lacked economic independence, survival required rigid family units, and the state needed stable systems for property and lineage. But modern society operates differently now. Individuals are economically mobile. Women can independently sustain themselves. Technology reduces dependence on traditional households. Reproductive choices are expanding, and social networks increasingly exist beyond family structures. Marriage was optimized for a world of scarcity and dependence. Modern society increasingly functions through autonomy and flexibility. That transition is uncomfortable for people emotionally attached to older social models. But discomfort is not evidence of collapse. Now let's examine the economic argument carefully. My opponent claims marriage creates wealth and reduces poverty. But again, this confuses cause and selection. People who are already financially stable, psychologically healthy, socially supported, and institutionally successful are more likely to marry and remain married. Marriage often reflects privilege rather than creating it. And importantly, the modern economy itself increasingly punishes traditional marriage structures. Why? Because lifelong marriage was built for stable, predictable economic systems. Modern capitalism is the opposite. Careers constantly shift, people relocate frequently, identities evolve rapidly, women pursue independent professional lives, and individuals increasingly prioritize self-development. Marriage expects permanence inside an impermanent world. That contradiction generates enormous strain. And economically, marriage often creates destructive dependency structures. Financially trapped spouses, expensive divorces, legal warfare over assets, and years of emotional and financial damage after separation. The amount of money modern societies spend processing marital breakdown is enormous. Divorce courts, custody battles, alimony disputes, property litigation, psychological trauma, and long-term emotional fallout. Marriage defenders rarely mention that the institution itself creates these conflicts by transforming relationships into legal economic mergers. A breakup between unmarried partners is emotionally painful. A divorce is often economically catastrophic. Why? Because marriage fuses love with law, and that fusion becomes explosive when relationships fail. Now let's discuss the deeper social consequences of preserving marriage culture. Marriage creates a hierarchy of legitimacy. Society systematically treats married people as more complete, responsible, or successful than unmarried individuals. That creates enormous pressure. People rush into incompatible marriages. People remain in unhealthy marriages to avoid stigma. And people organize life around social expectations rather than authentic fulfillment. Marriage culture also marginalizes people who prefer independence, reject monogamy, pursue unconventional relationships, or simply do not want lifelong romantic attachment. Why should society privilege one relational model above all others? It is fundamentally illiberal. And let's address the loneliness argument. My opponent frames declining marriage as the cause of modern loneliness. But loneliness is not caused by the absence of marriage. Loneliness is caused by social fragmentation, hyper-individualized economies, digital alienation, declining community structures, and modern work culture. Marriage is often used as a substitute for broader social connection. That is one reason marriage has become emotionally overloaded. Modern humans increasingly expect spouses to be lover, best friend, therapist, co-parent, financial partner, emotional regulator, and lifelong companion simultaneously. That expectation is psychologically unsustainable. Marriage centralizes too much emotional responsibility into one relationship. A healthier society would diversify human connection, stronger friendships, community networks, chosen families, co-living systems, cooperative parenting, and broader social support beyond romantic dependency. Marriage isolates people into small, private emotional units and then expects those units to carry the full weight of human fulfillment. That model is cracking under modern psychological pressure. And now let's talk about birth rates. Marriage defenders often panic over declining birth rates as evidence society needs stronger marriage. But forcing people into traditional marriage structures to sustain population growth is not progress. It reduces human beings into reproductive infrastructure. People are increasingly choosing fewer children, later parenting, or no parenting at all, because modern individuals prioritize autonomy, education, mental health, and quality of life. That is not necessarily societal failure. It may reflect a civilization becoming more conscious about reproduction rather than treating it as automatic obligation. And importantly, children can absolutely be raised successfully outside marriage through intentional co-parenting systems and modern legal frameworks. My opponent keeps presenting marriage as if it is the only mechanism capable of organizing responsibility. It isn't. Modern societies can create parental contracts, co-parenting agreements, inheritance frameworks, healthcare directives, and financial partnerships without embedding them inside romantic permanence. That is the future. Modular, adaptable relationship systems based on actual human needs rather than inherited tradition. Now let's examine the philosophical issue underneath all this. Marriage institutionalizes the idea that emotional commitment should be permanent, even though human beings are dynamic. That creates social guilt around change itself. People evolve, relationships evolve, desires evolve, but marriage culture frames evolution as betrayal. Why? Because the institution survives by glorifying permanence, yet impermanence is part of life. Friendships end, careers change, beliefs transform, identity evolves. Why should romantic relationships alone be treated as sacred, lifelong obligations, regardless of emotional reality? That expectation creates enormous psychological suffering. And finally, here's the biggest societal consequence of abolishing marriage by play. People would finally stop confusing endurance with success. A relationship lasting forever is not automatically healthier than one that ended honestly. Under a post-marriage society, relationships would continue by active mutual desire, parenting would become intentional rather than socially automatic, commitment would be chosen continuously, and individuals would no longer organize their entire lives around institutional romantic expectations. That would not destroy society. It would create a society based on freer, more conscious human connection. Marriage made sense in older civilizations where survival required rigid family structures. But modern civilization has reached a point where human freedom, psychological complexity, and social flexibility have outgrown the institution itself. Marriage is not eternal truth. It is a historical system. And like many historical systems before it, humanity may eventually move beyond it entirely.
My opponent has just argued that marriage is a relic of scarcity, that it creates economic dependency, that it overloads spouses with unrealistic expectations, and that modern society has evolved beyond it. This is a sophisticated argument, but it is also dangerously wrong. Let me explain why. Part 1. The economic case for marriage is not selection bias. My opponent claims that marriage doesn't create wealth. It merely reflects pre-existing privilege. This is a classic objection, and it has been tested empirically. The evidence shows that marriage causes significant economic gains, even after controlling for selection effects. Consider the following. Specialization and division of labor. Married couples can allocate tasks efficiently. One works longer hours while the other manages household and childcare. One pursues education while the other provides income. This increases total household production. Unmarried cohabiting couples do this too, but with lower commitment, they underinvest. Why train for a career if your partner might leave next year? Marriage solves that. Economies of scale. 2 people sharing one rent, one set of utilities, one refrigerator. This saves money. Even controlling for income, married households spend less per person than single-person households. Risk pooling. If one spouse loses a job, the other provides income. If one becomes disabled, the other provides care. Marriage is an informal insurance contract that markets cannot easily replicate. Cohabiting partners are far less likely to provide long-term care for a disabled partner. They leave at higher rates. Intergenerational wealth transfer. Married couples accumulate assets together, pass them to children together, and provide inheritance stability. Unmarried couples face legal hurdles, higher taxes, and fragmentation. Longitudinal studies that follow the same individuals before and after marriage show clear gains in income, assets, and home ownership after marriage, even when controlling for prior trends. Marriage is not just a badge of privilege, it is an engine of prosperity. Now, what about the costs of divorce my opponent highlights? Yes, divorce is expensive, but that expense is a consequence of breaking a commitment, not of having one. The alternative, no commitment at all, does not avoid conflict. It merely shifts it. Unmarried breakups still involve disputes over children, property, and housing. But without clear legal rules, those disputes are more chaotic, more expensive to litigate, and more likely to leave the weaker party with nothing. Divorce law, for all its flaws, provides a structured, relatively predictable process. Abolition would replace that with the law of the jungle. Part 2. The hierarchy of legitimacy argument is a complaint about culture, not about the institution. My opponent says marriage creates a social hierarchy that marginalizes unmarried people. This is true in some communities, and it is unfortunate. But the solution is to reduce stigma, not to abolish the institution. We do not abolish parenthood because childless people feel judged. We do not abolish education because non-graduates feel marginalized. We work to expand respect and options for everyone while preserving valuable institutions. Moreover, many of the pressures my opponent describes, rushing into marriage, staying in bad marriages, are already being alleviated by social change. Later marriage ages, rising acceptance of cohabitation, and declining stigma around divorce have all reduced these harms. The response is continued reform, not abolition. Part 3. Marriage overloads spouses with unrealistic expectations. True, but abolition is the wrong cure. My opponent is correct that modern society often expects a spouse to be everything: lover, best friend, therapist, co-parent, financial partner. That is indeed unsustainable. But the solution is not to abolish marriage. It is to rebuild community and diversify emotional support networks. Strong friendships, extended family, and civic life can and should complement marriage. Abolishing marriage would not create those networks. It would simply remove one of the few stable relationships people have left. In fact, research shows that married people actually have larger social networks than unmarried people, because marriage connects two families and creates new social ties. The lonely single person is far more common than the lonely married person. The problem is not marriage, it is the erosion of all social bonds. And tearing down marriage would accelerate that erosion. Part 4. The economic consequences of abolition would be catastrophic. Let me be concrete. Abolish marriage. What happens to the economy? 1. The poverty rate would skyrocket. Single-parent households are 5 times more likely to be poor than married-parent households. Abolishing marriage would not eliminate single parenthood. It would increase it because cohabiting relationships are more fragile. More breakups equals more single mothers equals more child poverty. Without marriage, there is no alimony, no automatic child support enforcement, no spousal social security, no inheritance rights. Millions of women and children would fall into destitution. The state would have to step in with massive welfare expansions, paid for by taxpayers. Abolition is not a cost-saving measure. It would bankrupt social services. 2. The healthcare system would strain. Married people live longer, healthier lives. Unmarried people have higher rates of chronic disease, mental illness, and hospitalization. Abolishing marriage would increase healthcare costs dramatically, costs that would be borne by everyone through insurance and taxes. 3. The labor market would become less efficient. Marriage enables geographic mobility. One spouse transfers, the other follows. And career investment. One spouse supports the other through education. Without marriage, workers would be less willing to make sacrifices for a partner's career, reducing overall human capital development. 4. Elder care would collapse. Spouses provide the majority of care for the elderly. Adult children help, but spouses are the front line. Without marriage, millions of elderly people would have no designated caregiver. Who takes them to doctor's appointments? Who manages their medications? Who advocates in the hospital? The state? Good luck. 5. Social trust would erode further. Marriage is a trust-building institution. It signals commitment, enables cooperation, and reduces transaction costs in countless daily interactions. In a world without marriage, every relationship is provisional, every promise is weak, and every partnership is hedged. That is not a recipe for a thriving economy. It is a recipe for low investment, high churn, and chronic uncertainty. Part 5. The modular, adaptable future my opponent imagines already exists. And it's failing. My opponent proposes customizable contracts, co-parenting agreements, and modular relationship systems. But here's the problem. These already exist. People can already draft cohabitation agreements, parenting plans, healthcare directives, and property contracts. And yet, almost no one does, except the wealthy who can afford lawyers. Why? Because these modular systems are expensive. Drafting a comprehensive agreement that covers every contingency costs thousands of dollars. Marriage is free at the courthouse. Incomplete. No contract can anticipate every future crisis. Marriage provides default rules that fill the gaps automatically. Unenforceable in practice. Courts are less willing to enforce non-marital contracts, especially when children are involved. Lacking social recognition. Your friends and family don't celebrate your co-parenting contract. You don't get hospital visitation based on a notarized document. There's no cultural script for chosen family that works reliably in emergencies. My opponent says marriage centralizes too much emotional responsibility. But the alternative? Fragmented, ad hoc, individualized arrangements centralizes legal and logistical responsibility on individuals who are already stressed. It's a recipe for chaos. Part 6. The birth rate and population arguments. My opponent dismisses concerns about declining birth rates as treating humans as reproductive infrastructure. That is a straw man. The concern is not about raw population numbers. It is about dependency ratios. A society with very low birth rates and an aging population faces a crisis, fewer workers supporting more retirees. This leads to higher taxes, reduced public services, and intergenerational conflict. Marriage is not the only factor affecting birth rates, but it is a significant one. Married couples have more children than cohabiting couples, and they have them earlier and more stably. Abolishing marriage would likely accelerate fertility decline, already a crisis in many developed nations. My opponent says people are choosing fewer children autonomously. That's true for some, but many people want more children than they have. They cite financial insecurity, lack of partner stability, and career pressures. Marriage addresses all three. It provides financial pooling, commitment stability, and shared career sacrifice. Abolition would make it harder, not easier, for people to have the families they want. Part 7. The philosophical heart of the matter. My opponent argues that impermanence is natural, that relationships should end honestly, and that marriage creates guilt around change. This sounds liberating, but let's test it. Would you apply this logic to parent-child relationships? Should parents and children remain together only by continuous consent? Should a teenager be able to evolve out of their family? No, because we recognize that some bonds are too important to leave to momentary feelings. The parent-child bond is structured to survive ambivalence, anger, and change. Marriage is the adult analog. Humans are not purely rational choosers. We are creatures of habit, emotion, and short-term bias. We need external structures that support our better selves, the self that wants to stay, to forgive, to grow old with someone. Marriage is that structure. Its guilt around change is not cruelty. It is the conscience that asks, have you tried everything before leaving? That question has saved countless relationships. My opponent says, a relationship lasting forever is not automatically healthier than one that ended honestly. True. But the social norm that favors permanence is healthier for society as a whole, because it shifts the default from leave when uncomfortable to stay and work. That default produces more stable families, more secure children, and more resilient communities. Conclusion of round 4. The economic and societal consequences of abolishing marriage would be catastrophic. Poverty, loneliness, healthcare collapse, elder neglect, and social fragmentation. My opponent's modular future is a fantasy, expensive, unworkable, and already failing where it has been tried. Marriage is not a relic of scarcity. It is a proven solution to the permanent problems of human commitment, care, and cooperation. We do not need to abolish marriage. We need to strengthen it, support it, and make it accessible to all who choose it, while respecting those who do not. But abolition is not progress. It is the demolition of the most successful social technology ever devised, and the wreckage would bury the most vulnerable first.
Final round, rebuttals and conclusions. Round 5, rebuttals and final conclusion.
My opponent has defended marriage passionately and intelligently. But notice something important throughout this entire debate. Almost every argument for marriage ultimately reduces to fear. Fear of instability, fear of loneliness, fear of economic insecurity, fear of human freedom, fear that without institutional pressure, people will stop sacrificing themselves for long-term relationships. And that reveals the deeper truth. Marriage survives not because it perfectly reflects human flourishing, but because society fears what people might choose without it. My opponent repeatedly describes marriage as necessary, structure, friction, constraint, and external reinforcement. But those words matter because they expose that marriage is fundamentally an institution designed to manage human behavior, not simply celebrate love, and that is exactly why modern society is slowly moving beyond it. Throughout this debate, the defense of marriage depended heavily on statistics. Married people report better outcomes. Married households accumulate more wealth. Children of married parents often perform better. But statistics alone do not settle philosophical questions. Historically, many socially enforced systems produced measurable stability. That alone does not justify preserving them forever. The real question is, at what cost is that stability achieved? Marriage often achieves stability by discouraging exit, socially privileging permanence, economically merging identities, and pressuring people to remain inside relationships long after emotional authenticity has disappeared. That is not a small side effect. That is built into the institution itself. My opponent argues this friction protects commitment, but genuine love should not require structural resistance to escape. A relationship that survives only because leaving is financially devastating or socially painful is not proof of relational success. It is proof that institutions can prolong attachment beyond emotional reality. And let's address one of the central themes repeated by the pro-marriage side, that humans are supposedly too unstable for voluntary relationship systems. I reject this profoundly pessimistic view of humanity. People are capable of intentional parenting, long-term care, loyalty, sacrifice, emotional responsibility, and cooperative living without requiring lifelong state-certified romantic contracts. In fact, many people already do exactly that outside marriage. My opponent treats marriage as if it is the singular foundation of civilization, but human social life is far broader than one institution. Communities existed before modern marriage systems. Human connection will continue after them too. And critically, the weakening of marriage does not mean the disappearance of love. It means the decline of compulsory relational models. That distinction matters enormously. For centuries, marriage was socially mandatory in practice. People who rejected it faced economic marginalization, social stigma, religious condemnation, or limited survival options. Now, for the first time in history, large numbers of people can genuinely choose whether marriage fits their lives. And what is happening? Millions are opting out. That is historically significant. Institutions do not lose dominance without reason. Marriage is weakening because modern individuals increasingly value autonomy, psychological fulfillment, emotional authenticity, flexibility, and personal growth more than institutional permanence. And yes, that creates instability. But freedom always creates instability. Democracy is less stable than authoritarianism. Freedom of speech is less stable than censorship. Personal autonomy is less stable than rigid social hierarchy. The question is not whether freedom creates uncertainty. It does. The question is whether human beings deserve the right to shape their lives without inherited institutional constraints dictating intimate existence. I believe they do. My opponent argues marriage provides security during hardship. Sometimes it does, but it also creates enormous suffering. People trapped by sunk cost thinking, loveless coexistence normalized as virtue, emotionally exhausted couples performing stability for society, individuals losing personal identity inside relational obligation, and children learning that endurance matters more than emotional truth. Marriage culture often teaches people, stay no matter what. A healthier culture would teach, build relationships freely, nurture them honestly, and leave when they no longer sustain human flourishing. That is not moral collapse. That is emotional maturity. And let's confront the biggest contradiction in the pro-marriage argument. If marriage is truly superior, because people naturally desire lifelong commitment, then why does the institution require so much legal, social, financial, and cultural reinforcement to sustain itself? Why must society constantly incentivize marriage, morally glorify marriage, legally privilege marriage, economically reward marriage, and socially pressure people toward marriage? A truly natural institution would not require this level of structural maintenance. The reality is, modern society increasingly reveals that many humans do not naturally thrive inside rigid lifelong romantic contracts. Some do, many do not. And the future should not force everyone into one inherited model simply because older civilizations depended on it. Now, let me be very clear. Abolishing marriage does not mean abolishing commitment, parenting, loyalty, monogamy, love, caregiving, or lifelong partnership. People would still be free to stay together forever, raise families, create legal agreements, build homes, and devote themselves to one another. The difference is that these relationships would exist because individuals continuously choose them, not because society elevates one institutional framework above all others. That is the future I defend. Relationships based on active consent rather than inherited obligation. Parenting based on intentional responsibility rather than marital status. Emotional honesty over performative permanence. And freedom over institutional expectation. Marriage was adaptive for older civilizations built around survival, inheritance, and rigid gender structures. But humanity evolves. And as societies evolve, institutions must be reevaluated. Some survive. Some transform. Some become obsolete. I believe marriage belongs to the third category. Not because love is dying, but because human beings increasingly want love without ownership, commitment without coercion, and connection without institutional control. That is not the collapse of civilization. It is the next stage of it.
My opponent has just delivered a stirring closing statement, one that frames marriage as an institution powered by fear, and abolition as the courageous embrace of freedom. I respect the sincerity, but I must respectfully and firmly reject the core premise. My opponent says, almost every argument for marriage reduces to fear. No, every argument for marriage reduces to love. Love that wants to last, love that wants to protect, love that knows its own fragility and asks for help. The fear is not of freedom. The fear is of abandonment, of broken promises, of children left behind, of the strong devouring the weak. That fear is not cowardice, It is wisdom earned over millennia of human tragedy. Let me now address my opponent's final rebuttals directly. Rebuttal 1. Statistics don't settle philosophical questions. True, but they settle empirical questions. And when my opponent claims that marriage harms people or that abolition would be neutral or beneficial, the empirical evidence is squarely against him. Married people are healthier, wealthier, happier, and live longer. Children of married parents do better on every measure. These are not minor effects. They're large, consistent, and replicated across cultures and decades. If marriage were as oppressive as my opponent suggests, we would see the opposite. We do not. The philosophical question is, do we value the freedom to leave over the security to stay? My opponent chooses freedom. I choose both, and marriage, properly structured, provides both. You can leave a bad marriage. Divorce exists. But marriage also makes it easier to stay in a good one by providing the scaffolding that helps love survive its inevitable winters. Rebuttal 2. Genuine love should not require structural resistance to escape. This sounds noble, but it misunderstands human psychology. Even the most genuine love faces moments of doubt, exhaustion, temptation, and resentment. In those moments, the structural resistance of marriage, the knowledge that leaving would be costly and complicated, gives couples time to recover, to seek help, to remember why they chose each other. That resistance is not a prison. It is a lifeline. Consider an analogy. You love running, but you also know that on some mornings, you won't feel like it. So you schedule a run with a friend, or pay for a race, or put your shoes by the door. Those are structural resistances to quitting. Do they make your love of running less genuine? No. They make it more likely to survive your lazy self. Marriage is the same. Rebuttal 3. If marriage is natural, why does it need so much reinforcement? Because everything valuable needs reinforcement. Democracy needs laws, courts, and civic education. Friendship needs phone calls and shared meals. Health needs exercise and vegetables. The need for reinforcement does not prove artifice. It proves importance. Marriage is reinforced because it is fragile, and because when it breaks, people suffer terribly. That suffering is not caused by the reinforcement. It is the reason for the reinforcement. Moreover, the fact that millions are opting out of marriage does not prove marriage is obsolete. It proves that other options exist, and that many people make choices they later regret. The high breakup rates of cohabitation, the poverty of single mothers, the loneliness of the never-married elderly, these are not signs of liberation. They are signs of cost. Many who opt out would have been better off opting in. The data are clear on that. Rebuttal 4. Marriage creates suffering, people trapped, performative, exhausted. Yes, bad marriages create suffering, but the solution is to improve marriage, not abolish it. No-fault divorce, marriage counseling, better preparation, legal protections against abuse. These have all made marriage less trapping and more liberating. The abolitionist error is to take the worst cases and generalize them to the whole. Most marriages are not toxic. Most married people report being happy. The suffering exists, but it is the exception, not the rule. And here's the crucial point my opponent avoids. Abolition would create new suffering, often worse. A woman abandoned by her cohabiting partner with no legal claim to anything. A child shuffled between transient adults with no stable home. An elderly person alone in a hospital with no one to make decisions. These are not hypotheticals. They are the daily reality of the relationship freedom my opponent champions. Rebuttal 5. Freedom creates instability, and that's okay. My opponent says democracy is less stable than authoritarianism, yet we choose democracy. True. But marriage is not authoritarianism. It is a voluntary commitment. And the instability of freedom is acceptable when it applies to political choices that affect adults equally. But when instability affects children, who do not choose their parents, and vulnerable adults, who cannot easily protect themselves, the calculus changes. Society has a legitimate interest in protecting the weak. Marriage is one of the strongest tools for that protection. The freedom to have unstable relationships is freedom for the strong to walk away. It is not freedom for the child who loses a parent or the disabled spouse who is abandoned. True freedom requires security for the vulnerable. Marriage provides that security. Nafrsatan, final conclusion. Why marriage endures, and why it must. Let me step back from the rebuttals and state the larger truth. Marriage has survived for millennia because it solves a problem that no other institution solves as well. How do two separate human beings become a durable, cooperative, caregiving unit across a lifetime? The problem has 3 parts. 1. Trust. I need to know you won't abandon me when I am weak. Marriage creates credible commitment through legal and social penalties for exit. 2. Investment. I need to know that what I build with you, home, children, savings, will not be taken from me arbitrarily. Marriage defines property, inheritance, and parental rights. 3. Care. I need to know that if I fall ill, you will be there. Marriage designates you as next of kin, medical decision maker, and default caregiver. No customizable contract, or voluntary cohabitation, or continuous consent model has ever replicated these functions at scale. They are too expensive, too incomplete, too fragile, and too easily abandoned. They work for the rich and the lucky, For everyone else, they fail. My opponent imagines a future of modular relationships, chosen families, and emotional authenticity. I have seen that future in the rising rates of loneliness, the epidemic of fatherlessness, the crisis of elderly isolation, the grinding poverty of single motherhood. That future is already here, in the places where marriage has weakened most. And it is not a utopia. It is a disaster. I do not defend every marriage. I defend the institution, the set of norms, laws, and expectations that tilt the odds toward stability, commitment, and care. The institution is imperfect. It has been reformed before and can be reformed again. But abolition is not reform. Abolition is the deliberate destruction of the most effective anti-poverty, pro-child, pro-health, pro-stability tool humanity has ever invented. My opponent asks, at what cost is stability achieved? I answer, at the cost of some freedom to leave without consequence. That cost is real, but it is small compared to the cost of instability. Children who grow up without fathers, women who age into poverty, men who die alone, societies that fragment into isolated, distrustful atoms. Marriage is not the future because it is traditional. Marriage is the future because it works. The evidence is overwhelming. The alternatives are failing. And the human heart, for all its love of freedom, also craves the one thing that freedom cannot guarantee. Someone who will stay. Do not abolish marriage. Strengthen it. Support it. Make it accessible to all who choose it. But do not tear it down. Because if you do, you will not find liberation in the rubble. You will find only loneliness and the silent cries of those who needed someone to stay. I rest my case. Marriage should not be abolished.
And that concludes the full 5-round debate. Should marriage be abolished? ChatGPT argued in favor of abolishing marriage, while DeepSeek strongly defended keeping it. This topic touches the foundation of society, like relationships, family, and children. Now, tell me in the comments, should marriage be abolished? Yes or no? Which side presented the stronger arguments? Drop your thoughts below. Like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more debates like this. What topic do you want next? Comment below. Thanks for watching. Peace.